Hey everybody and welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about a personal hero of mine, and he's a guy who went from being a simple school teacher to a military general. But honestly, what makes this story so interesting to me is how a critical decision he would make in the heat of battle would change not only his life, but all of US history. So if that's something you're interested in, stick around with me to the end of the video where we learn about the school teacher who saved the United States. During the Civil War in June of 1863, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army were marching through northern Virginia into southern Pennsylvania. A group of Confederate soldiers heard about a stash of supplies in a nearby town and headed off to capture them. Upon arriving, they discovered two things. One, there were no supplies. They had been sent farther north a couple days earlier. That way the Confederates couldn't get a hold of them. And they discovered two, in their place was a group of Union soldiers. Fighting quickly broke out between the two sides, and what started as a small skirmish quickly escalated into a full-on battle. And soon both sides were sending word back to command that reinforcements were needed in the small town of Gettysburg. Now, it's worth stopping to note why the Confederacies were in Pennsylvania in the first place. If you remember any of your high school history classes, you'll remember that the US during the Civil War looked something like this. Notice that Virginia was the northernmost state that the Confederacy controlled. So why were they up in Northern Territory? After all, they were the one leaving the United States, which meant it was the Union's job to invade the South, not vice versa. Just think of the American Revolution, right? When the 13 colonies left Great Britain, it's not as though they had to go over to Great Britain and invade London. No, they just had to kick the British out of the 13 colonies and basically just wait for the British to attack them. So why was the Confederacy so far north? The reason for this is something that we often forget, but for the majority of the Civil War, the Union was not winning. In fact, they were losing pretty badly. See, what had initially been thought to be maybe a couple quick battles had turned into this long, bloody, drawn-out conflict. And the Confederates had managed to frustrate the Union pretty well. The northern armies of the Union had yet to win a real battle at this point in the war. Keep in mind, the war's been going on for almost 2 years. The closest thing that they had to a victory was the Battle of Antietam 6 months earlier, but that had ended in a draw. And when you look at the numbers, the Union outnumbered the Confederates nearly 2-1. The real issue is the Union frankly lacked leadership. Up until this point, the Union had had 6 different commanders in a 2-year period. They had gone from McDowell to McClellan to Pope to McClellan again, then Burnside, Hooker, and finally Meade. Keep in mind, this is a 2-year period. I mean, this is faster than the UK changes prime ministers. What this is all to say is that the Union Army was pretty demoralized at this point, plus the war was not very popular in the North. So Lee felt that if he could go into the northern states and apply a little bit of pressure, that one, troops in other parts of the South would have to go back north to protect the northern states, and two, with the war as unpopular as it is, and with battles now on their own doorstep, the people would force Abraham Lincoln to come suing for peace. So back to the Battle of Gettysburg. With some fighting, the Confederates were able to push the Union soldiers outside of the small town. In the afternoon, General Lee arrived and he began making plans for an attack for the following morning. At the same time, the Union soldiers regrouped in a cemetery that was set on a hill outside of town, as well as in some of the surrounding ridges. A really funny fact is that the cemetery actually had a sign that was posted before the war, and it read, all persons found using firearms will be prosecuted to the utmost rigor of the law. Super ironic. And I can't help but imagine that there must have been some sort of Karen HOA in the town of Gettysburg who's like watching Desperate Housewives of the 1800s and like looks out of her windows and says, "My gosh, what are they doing?" And goes running out. "Have you not read the sign? You cannot do this. And please make sure the grass does not grow above 1.5 inches." We have no evidence of that happening, but it would have been really funny if it did. During the night, both Confederate and Union troops kept arriving. By morning time, there was over 65,000 Confederate soldiers and 85,000 Union soldiers gathered around the town of Gettysburg. The Confederates held the town, while the Union soldiers had now spread out over a series of ridges outside of town. On the very far left of the Union Army were two hills, Big Round Top and Little Round Top. Despite its name, Little Round Top was actually the most important of these two hills because it was this hill that overlooked the entire Union position. In other words, should this hill fall, the Union Army would probably fall because you could just put a couple cannons on top and blast the Union Army to smithereens with artillery shells. Now, this is where things get crazy. Both of these hills were supposed to be guarded by Major General Sickles, a man who before the war was most famous for, I kid you not, gunning down his wife's lover in broad daylight in front of the White House. For some unknown reason, rather than using the hills for protection, he was nearly half a mile in front of them in a flat, open, exposed position. The Confederates were able to take advantage of the situation, drive him back, and take Big Round Top. The Confederate leader, General Oates, once he arrived on top of Big Round Top, looked over and was surprised to see that Little Round Top was completely unguarded. He later would say that if he could take the hill, that, quote, within half an hour I could convert Little Round Top into a Gibraltar that I could hold against 10 times the number of men that I had. At the same time, the Union Army also realized that the hill had been left unguarded. They quickly dispatched 4 regiments to go and hold the hill. On the extreme left of the position was the 20th of Maine. Led by Joshua Lawerence Chamberlain, they had orders to hold the hill at all costs. The Battle of Gettysburg now rested in their hands. So Joshua Lawerence Chamberlain is a fascinating character. He was born in Brewer, Maine in 1828, first of 5 kids. But his father wanted him to have a military career. So he had him enlisted in a military academy where he spent a couple of years. However, he wasn't a fan of that. Chamberlain wasn't. So what he did is he self-taught himself Greek so he could get into a local college, which is crazy. And next time you're stressing about like a test for school, at least be grateful that you don't have to literally self-teach yourself a dead language in order to pass the test. But he would do great at school, he would graduate, and actually a couple years later, he would come back to the same college where he would become a professor. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Chamberlain was a very vocal supporter for the Union in its fight against the Confederacy. Multiple times in classes, he would advocate for his students to drop out and to enlist in the Army. Obviously, this is something his supervisors did not like. Because, I mean, if there's one thing that colleges know is that you can't charge $20,000 for a fine arts degree to a dead man. Subsequently, they gave him leave to go off to Europe and study languages. He immediately used that leave to go to the nearest recruitment office, where he enlisted in the 20th of Maine, and by the time of Gettysburg had actually risen to become its colonel. When Chamberlain arrived at Little Round Top, he had less than 10 minutes to prepare before the Confederates would arrive. He ordered his men in a straight line with his left flank at a 90-degree angle so as not to be outflanked. At the last moment, he ordered his Company B to his right flank in order to strengthen it. Before they could get into position, the Confederates arrived. Between the barrage of bullets and their exposed position, Chamberlain feared the worst. They were all but wiped out. And now his 385 men had been whittled down to a mere 300. Now charging up the hill were 680 Confederate soldiers, 2 full regiments, led by William C. Oates, and they were determined to take the hill. If the Confederates could take Little Round Top, they would not only win the Battle of Gettysburg, but the Civil War would be permanently tipped in their favor. Now with the decisive battle in Northern Territory that they had won, it would change the entire dynamic of the war. Other Union troops positioned to the south would come up to northern states to protect them, and no longer was it a goal of kicking the Union troops out, but putting pressure on these northern states. The citizens up in these northern states would not want this, and it's more likely than not that they would force Abraham Lincoln to come to Jefferson Davis and sue for peace. So in other words, on this hill rested the hopes of the Union Army and the nation. It came down to Chamberlain and a small group of soldiers from Maine. 6 times the Alabamans drove the men from Maine from their position, and 6 times they retook the hill. Chamberlain would later vividly redescribe the events, saying, "At times I saw around me more of the enemy than of my own men, gaps opening, swallowing, closing again, squads of stalwart men who had cut their way through us, disappearing as if translated. All around a strange mingled roar." After the sixth charge, the the 20th of Maine was out of ammo. They had nothing left to chamber their guns with. They were at a point that they were scavenging their fallen comrades for enough ammunition to hold off the Alabamans. With not enough ammo to hold the hill, Chamberlain had two options. They could charge forward into certain death where they were outnumbered, or they could retreat and give the hill to the Confederates on a silver platter. And by giving them the hill, they also gave them the battle and maybe even the war. Chamberlain, understanding what was at stake, ordered his men to fix bayonets and to advance forward. As the Union soldiers charged forward down the hill, Chamberlain ordered his left flank, which if you recall had been positioned at like a 90-degree angle, to swing forward like a door on hinges and slam into the left side of the Confederates. At the same time, on the right side, Company B, who Chamberlain had assumed had been wiped out earlier, miraculously appeared and began opening fire. Rather than being wiped out earlier when Chamberlain had ordered them over to the right flank, they'd actually, when the Confederates arrived, had managed to take shelter behind a small stone wall. So when they heard the Union charge, they jumped out from behind this wall and opened fire. The Alabamans, now surrounded on three sides, completely surprised to see where these other soldiers came from, quickly surrendered. It was, in a matter of minutes, it was over. Little Round Top had held. The battle was saved. The victory was not cheap. Union and Confederate forces would suffer nearly 25% casualty rates, which is staggering to think about. But with Little Round Top held, the Union line was now secure. The next morning, General Lee would commit one of the biggest blunders in the Civil War, if not the biggest blunder in the Civil War, in the now infamous Pickett's Charge. This is where he ordered over 12,000 Confederate soldiers to charge across 3/4 of a mile of open flat fields where they would be absolutely torn apart by Union artillery. Gettysburg became the turning point of the Civil War. This was the northernmost point that the Southern troops would advance, and after Gettysburg, Lee would not win another major battle in the Civil War. And in part, this victory was due to just a small group of Manians. Maynards? Maines? Mullets? Soldiers from Maines. As for Chamberlain, he would continue to fight valiantly for the Union throughout the rest of the Civil War. A year later, in the Battle of St. Petersburg, while leading a charge, he would be shot in the pelvic area. He would then support himself on his sword and encourage his men onward, and only after they had passed him, he would collapse to the ground and begin bleeding out. General Grant was called to his side and gave him the battlefield promotion of brigadier general because they assumed the wound was fatal. Despite the fact that many newspapers would falsely report his death, he would miraculously not only survive this wound, but would continue fighting in the Civil War. In the final years of the war, Chamberlain would continue to fight, and two more times would be gravely injured, and two more times continue to fight despite his injuries. He would, because of his actions, earn the nickname Bloody Chamberlain, which has to be one of the most fear-inducing war names I have ever heard. He would be there at Appomattox Courthouse when the Confederates surrendered, and actually would probably be responsible for one of the most chivalrous acts of all Civil War history, which is when the Confederates were surrendering, he ordered his men to salute them. This was something unpopular with a lot of the Union soldiers because they just fought a 4-year bloody war with them. But so important when you look back at it because Chamberlain was showing what needed to happen if this country that had just been torn apart by 4 years of war would ever be repaired and be won again. Chamberlain would return back to Maine after the war and would serve 4 consecutive 1-year terms as governor, after which he would become president of Bowdoin College. And Bowdoin College is the same college from before the war where he had served as professor and been given leave from the college. After over 10 years as its president, he would retire and go on to have numerous business and civic activities. In 1893, Congress recognized his valiant efforts of him as well as all the other soldiers from Maine on Little Round Top, and he would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. It was, however, the Civil War that would eventually kill Chamberlain. From the time he was first injured at the Battle of St. Petersburg in 1864, he's forced to use a catheter in a bag for the rest of his life. Throughout his life, he would undergo 6 separate operations to try to get rid of the infections and the fevers that plagued him, but none of them were successful. And it was in 1914, at the age of 85, he would die due to complications from this wound. He was the last Civil War veteran that we know that died due to complications from their wounds, which makes him the last known Civil War casualty. Historians argue about the importance of Little Round Top up until today. Historians who are against the idea of its importance tend to argue that, one, it might not have been as good of an artillery spot as previously believed, and two, they point to the fact that there were Union reinforcements within a mile's distance. So even if the Confederates had taken the hill, a Union counterattack could have retaken the hill, especially because Confederate troops would have been exhausted and maybe low on ammo because of the efforts they used in taking the hill in the first place. The other point of view that I would say the majority of historians hold is that Little Round Top was a critically important moment in Civil War history. And there are 3 arguments for this. One, you can debate how many cannons could have been placed on Little Round Top or how effective they would have been, but it's undeniable that if Little Round Top had fallen, it would have changed General Lee's battle plan completely. He attacked on the 3rd day, did the infamous Pickett's Charge, only because he had attacked on the left flank and on the right flank and had found that both of the sides were strong, so he basically said, it must be in the middle where they are weak. Had Little Round Top fallen, maybe you could argue that the Union Army wouldn't have been completely decimated by artillery fire, but now the Confederates had some high ground on the Union soldiers and were in a good position to almost completely outflank the Union soldiers. So I think that's one of the most convincing arguments. The second one being that even if there had been Union reinforcements nearby, let's suppose the Confederates take the hill. They outnumber the Union soldiers nearly 2 to 1, and they were barely able to take the hill. It's hard for me to imagine that there would have been a Union force big enough nearby that they would have been able to overtake the Confederate soldiers, unless they maybe you could make the argument that they completely ran out of ammo. But I think that's even though Chamberlain's men were running out of ammo, again they were running out of ammo just because they were outnumbered 2 to 1, right? You would have needed a massive force to take the hill to retake this hill. And I think the third big one comes from Chamberlain's rival in this situation, or not necessarily rival, but enemy, which was Colonel William C. Oates, who led, General William C. Oates, who led the Confederate charge. He would later recount about the battle on Little Round Top and say, Colonel Chamberlain's skill and persistency and the great bravery of his men saved Little Round Top and the Army of Potomac from defeat. If one more Confederate regiment had stormed the far left of the Army of Potomac with the 15th Alabama, we would have completely turned the flank and have won Little Round Top, which would have forced Meade's whole left wing to retire. He concluded philosophically that great events sometimes turn on comparatively small affairs. I think that's the most convincing thing, is that a Confederate general who was there fighting against him said, yeah, had I had just a little bit more men, we would have destroyed this guy. And that it's just this, that's how war works. Sometimes we look at war as these giant military plans and it's all these big moments, but a lot of times it's these small things. There was over 150,000 people fighting in Gettysburg, but it was a group of less than 1,000 men who truly ended up determining the battle. And that is what convinces me so much. Putting aside the events surrounding Little Round Top, I think what makes this story so incredible is Chamberlain himself. This was a man who, in a time when most of the leaders of the Civil War, most of the generals, had been politicians, or they were these wealthy, well-connected men, or they had been to West Point for several years, this was a pretty simple man who rose to extraordinary extraordinary moments that called him. Sure, he'd been to military academy for a couple of years as a teenager, but you can't argue to me that, like, 20 years ago, going to a couple of years of military high school is anything equivalent to going to West Point for several years or serving the military for 10 years. Besides that, as a professor, he had every excuse to get out of the war, right? He could have kept his mouth quiet, he could run off to Europe, but instead he chose to risk his job, encourage those to fight around him, and went out and went and fought in the war. And that really reflects in how he fought. He was very loyal to the men around him, as well as he seemed to have a greater understanding of what the war was about, which is, yes, the war was about slavery, but it's also about identity more than anything. The At the end of the war, he understood that there were terrible wounds that had happened, and this country needed to come together, and he was compassionate to his enemies. And besides that, throughout the war, he never shrank away from dangerous moments. He was brave in the face of battle. And that's something I think we can all learn from. I'd just like to thank you all for watching this video. This was a really fun story for me to research and to tell you about. There's a lot more that I could have told you that I had to cut out that maybe someday I'll get the chance to tell you. But since you're already here, feel free to subscribe to the channel, to hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next video. Change the world.